The private jet cabin was silent, dangerously silent. The only sound, the ticking of a luxury watch. Victoria Langford, a powerful CEO, sat reviewing billion-dollar files. Across from her, a little girl burst into a sudden, crystalline laugh. Victoria looked up. She froze. Her digital pen slipped, clattering onto the table. She stared into the girl's eyes, tracing that face. The nose, the cheekbones, the dimple. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned to the man beside the child. "Daniel, why does she look exactly like me?" The man didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just sat there, and he didn't blink. The hum of the engines was the only thing filling the cabin of the Gulfstream G650. Outside, the world was a blur of white clouds and high-altitude blue at 38,000 feet. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with professional tension, cold and calculated, the way Victoria liked it. Daniel Mercer sat in the opposite plush leather seat. At 45, he carried the kind of quiet authority that didn't need a title, though his title was legendary. He was a consultant for global logistics, the man brought in when empires were on the verge of collapse. But today, his posture was different. He wasn't leaning into a spreadsheet. He was leaning toward the child next to him. His daughter, Clara, was 8 years old. She was a quiet child, currently lost in a world of colored pencils and a thick sketchbook. Victoria Langford, 43, and known as the Ice Queen, had barely glanced at them when they boarded. She had a multi-billion-dollar contract to finalize before they touched down in London, and emotions were not part of her quarterly projections. "Mr. Mercer," Victoria had said as they leveled off, "I appreciate you joining this flight. I know the short notice was inconvenient." "It was," Daniel had replied simply, "but the data you sent over suggested a level of urgency that couldn't wait for a Zoom call." Victoria had nodded, impressed by his directness. She had lived her life surrounded by yes men who trembled at her shadow. Daniel Mercer did not tremble. He spoke to her as an equal, which was rare. Clara was only there because of a family emergency with Daniel's nanny. Victoria hadn't complained. She was too professional for that, but her silence had been a clear indicator that the child was to be seen and not heard. The jet was a mobile fortress, minimalist decor, dark wood, and the faint, bitter scent of expensive espresso. For 40 minutes, they worked in silence. Daniel walked her through the redirected supply chains in Southeast Asia, his voice steady and clinical. Then it happened. Clara was looking at a photo on her father's phone, a picture of a clumsy golden retriever puppy they had seen at the airport terminal. The girl let out a laugh so pure, so jarringly human, that it shattered the professional vacuum of the cabin. Victoria stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes moved from the iPad to the girl. At first, it was a casual glance of irritation. But then, Victoria's eyes narrowed. She saw it. She saw the shape of the girl's jawline, sharp and determined. She saw the specific, slightly arched curve of her eyebrows that peaked exactly where Victoria's did when she was curious. Most of all, she saw the eyes, a unique, piercing shade of hazel that Victoria saw every morning in her own mirror. A color she had often been told was impossible to replicate. It was like looking at a ghost, or a photograph of herself from 35 years ago, pulled from an old box in an attic she had locked and burned. Victoria's hand began to tremble. Just slightly. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, followed by a heat that flushed her cheeks. The contract, the logistics, the billions of dollars, they all vanished into the thin air outside. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a tone Daniel had never heard before. It wasn't the voice of a CEO who could ruin a company with a single email. It was the voice of a woman who had just seen the impossible. "Daniel," she said, her eyes locked on the little girl, who was now looking up at her with a curious, wide-eyed gaze. Why does she look like me?" Victoria's mind was racing through impossible scenarios. She had never had children. She had never been a donor. She had spent her 20s in a relentless pursuit of power, leaving no room for a family. Yet here was a child that looked like her clone. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a legal question. It was a moment of raw, terrifying realization. The girl looked more like Victoria than Victoria looked like herself in her memories. The resemblance was so striking, so hauntingly perfect, that for a second, Victoria wondered if she was hallucinating from the altitude. Daniel didn't panic. He didn't shift in his seat or try to distract her with talk of shipping lanes. He simply closed his laptop with a quiet click, placed his hands on his lap, and looked Victoria straight in the eyes. He had been waiting for this moment. He had seen the shock in her eyes at the terminal, even if she had tried to hide it. The silence in the cabin became heavy, pressing against the windows. Clara, sensing the shift in the adults, stopped laughing. She looked between the two, her small face, that identical face, reflecting a sudden, quiet maturity. The cabin pressure felt like it had doubled. Victoria's heart was hammering against her ribs, a rhythmic thud that made her ears ring. She waited for Daniel to make a joke, to say it was a coincidence, or to claim he had used a surrogate who just happened to look like her. But Daniel Mercer didn't play games. He never had. "She looks like you," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady, like a captain navigating through a storm. "Because she reminds you of someone you used to be, and she reminds you of a time you spent 20 years trying to bury." Victoria's brow furrowed, her defensive walls rising. "What is that supposed to mean, Daniel? Are you suggesting there's some biological link?" "I know my own history." "I'm not suggesting anything biological, Victoria," Daniel interrupted softly. "I know exactly who Clara's mother was. I was there when she took her first breath, and I was there when she took her last. And so do you. You know her story, even if you never met her." 20 years ago, the memory hit Victoria like a physical blow to the chest. Before the MBA, before the boardrooms of London and New York, before she became the Ice Queen. She was a different person then. She was a student at a small, prestigious university, bright-eyed and full of dreams that didn't involve profit margins or hostile takeovers. She wanted to build things. She wanted to change the world with architecture. And Daniel was the boy who sat in the back of her Economics 101 class, the one who always had a book of poetry hidden inside his textbook. They had dated for one intense, beautiful year. It was the kind of young love that feels like the end of the world because you haven't seen the rest of it yet. They had spent nights on the roof of the library, talking about traveling to places that weren't on any map. They had promised to stay together forever. But then Victoria got the offer, an elite full-ride MBA program in Europe, in a fast track to the global elite. She had asked Daniel to come with her. She had pleaded. But Daniel's father was sick, and his family's small logistics business was failing. He couldn't leave. He wouldn't leave. He didn't want to be a shadow following her around Europe while she conquered the world. So Victoria chose. She didn't hesitate for more than a night. She chose the career. She chose the ambition. She left for London, and she never looked back. She had deleted his number on the flight over. She had ignored his letters until they stopped coming. She built a wall around her heart made of steel, dividends, and professional coldness. "Clara is 8, Daniel continued, glancing at his daughter with a look of pure, unfiltered devotion that made Victoria's heart ache with envy. "My wife, Sarah. She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. She was a wonderful woman, Victoria. A painter. A soul that saw color in everything." Victoria let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. A wave of relief washed over her. There was no scandal, no secret child. But beneath it was a strange, hollow ache. Clara wasn't hers. "Then why?" Victoria asked, her voice cracking. "How is this possible? The eyes and the way she holds her pen, it's exactly how I was. It's uncanny." Daniel leaned in. "It's not DNA, Victoria. It's a trick of the light and a trick of the heart. I married a woman who had your spirit. She had your fire, your stubbornness. And yes, she even had your hazel eyes. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I think I was looking for you in everyone I met." Victoria's eyes widened. "And Clara?" Daniel whispered. "She's the perfect blend of her mother and, well, the ghost of you. She grew up in a house filled with the same books you loved. I taught her to be brave, just like you were. The resemblance isn't about blood. It's about the memory of a woman I once loved more than life itself. My mind has shaped her into a reminder of what was lost. Victoria looked at Clara again. The girl was back to her drawing, unaware of the tectonic plates shifting in the room. Victoria realized that the similarity wasn't a biological fact. It was a psychological haunting. Daniel had unconsciously sought out a life that reflected the one he lost when Victoria walked away. The realization was more painful than a secret child would have been. It meant that for 20 years, while she was building her kingdom of glass and steel, Daniel had been building a living, breathing tribute to the woman she used to be. "I thought I erased that version of myself," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the jet. "I worked so hard to kill her off." "You can't erase the soul, Victoria," Daniel replied, his voice tinged with a sad smile. "You just hide it under expensive suits and private jets. But the soul has a way of showing up, even at 30,000 feet. Victoria felt a tear threaten to spill, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. She had spent 2 decades being the person everyone feared. But in the eyes of an 8-year-old girl who wasn't even hers, she was seeing the girl she had murdered for a corner office. If you believe that sometimes the biggest questions aren't about legal truths, but about the emotions we never gave ourselves closure on, subscribe to follow the rest of this conversation inside the jet. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted. It softened from a sharp, cold edge into a warm, heavy blanket of nostalgia and regret. Victoria reached for her glass of crystal clear water, her fingers finally steady. She looked out the window at the endless, glowing horizon. "I thought about you, Daniel, more than I'd ever admit to a board of directors. For the first few months in London, I walked around like a ghost. I'd check my phone every hour, waiting for a call I knew wouldn't come because I hadn't given you my new number." Daniel nodded slowly, a faraway look in his eyes. "I almost went to the airport once. I had my bag packed. I was standing in front of the departures board, looking for a flight to Heathrow. But I realized, if I followed you, I would always be the man who held you back. You were meant for the sky, Victoria. I was meant for the ground. I didn't want you to resent me for the dreams you didn't get to chase." "I wasn't meant for anything," Victoria snapped, though there was no malice in it. "I chose this. I chose the ambition. I chose the solitude because I thought it was the price of success. I told myself that feelings were a liability, like a bad debt on a balance sheet." She looked at Clara. The girl had moved on from drawing to reading a thick, weathered book on architecture. The way the girl chewed her bottom lip while focusing, it was a mirror of Victoria's own habit, one she had been told made her look unprofessional by her first mentor. "She's reading about bridges," Victoria noted, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "She's obsessed with how things are held together," Daniel said, a proud warmth in his voice. "Just like you were when you were 8. Do you remember that summer at the lake? You spent 3 days trying to build a bridge across the stream using nothing but flat rocks and mud. You wouldn't eat, you wouldn't sleep. You just wanted to make sure it wouldn't fall." Victoria laughed. It was a short, surprised sound that filled the cabin. "I had forgotten that. My father told me I was wasting my time. He said I should focus on the family business instead of playing in the mud." "And yet look at you now," Daniel said. "You're still building things, just on a much larger, much colder scale." Victoria looked at the girl, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a window into her own soul. The resemblance wasn't just physical, it was the energy, the fearlessness. The way Clara sat with her back perfectly straight, unafraid of the powerful, intimidating woman sitting across from her. "You were fearless at 8, Victoria," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper so Clara wouldn't hear. "You believed you could build a bridge to the moon. Somewhere along the way, you stopped building bridges and started building walls. High, thick walls that no one could climb." Victoria didn't get angry. She couldn't. He was right. She began to tell Daniel about the struggles of the last few years. Not the profit margins, but the loneliness. The betrayals in the boardroom where friends would sell her out for a 0.5% increase in stock price. The exhaustion of being the first one in and the last one out. The way the view from her penthouse felt more like a glass cage than a victory. For the first time in her career, She wasn't talking as a CEO. She was talking as a woman who was tired of being cold. Daniel listened with the patience of a man who had seen the worst of life and survived it. He talked about Sarah, how she had fought the cancer with a grace that broke him. He spoke of the quiet life they had built in a small town, the house with the overgrown garden, the way they spent Sunday mornings making pancakes that always turned out a bit burnt, listening to old records while Clara danced on the kitchen table. It wasn't a billionaire's life, Daniel said softly. There were no private jets, but it was a full one. When Sarah passed, I thought the world had ended. I thought I would lose my mind, but then I'd look at Clara and I'd see that spark, that same spark I saw in you 20 years ago. It kept me going. It reminded me that even if the person is gone, the spirit remains. The cabin was no longer a place of business. It was a confessional. Two adults, separated by time, wealth, and choices, finally facing the reality of the paths they took. Victoria realized that the girl looking like her wasn't a threat to her professional image. It was a gift. It was a chance to see the person she was before the world told her she had to be someone else. I'm sorry about Sarah, Daniel, Victoria said, and for the first time in years, the words weren't a formality. She must have been incredible to have raised a girl like that. She was, Daniel said, and she knew all about you. She knew you were the one who taught me how to be brave enough to love someone in the first place. She always said she owed you a debt of gratitude for breaking my heart so she could be the one to put it back together. The engines hummed a lower tone as the jet began its long, slow arc across the Atlantic. The shadows in the cabin lengthened as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over everything. Victoria felt a strange, terrifying peace. The why didn't matter anymore. The fact that she was here in this moment was enough to make her realize she wanted to change. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered on with a soft, melodic chime. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their final descent into London. Victoria looked over at Clara. The girl had put her book down and was looking out the window at the distant twinkling lights of the city. "Clara?" Victoria called out softly. The girl turned, her hazel eyes bright and focused. "Yes, Victoria. What do you want to be when you grow up?" "Really?" The little girl didn't hesitate. "An architect," she said firmly, echoing her father's earlier words. "But I want to build cities that don't hurt the trees. I want people to live in the forest, not instead of it." Victoria felt a lump in her throat so large it was hard to swallow. "That was my dream," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to build sustainable cities. I had sketches of buildings with gardens on every floor. I wanted to change the skyline of New York without destroying the earth." "Sorry," Clara tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Why didn't you do it?" Victoria looked around at her empire. The expensive iPad, the hand-stitched leather, the gold-trimmed panels that cost more than a suburban house. "I got busy building companies instead," she said honestly. "I got distracted by the numbers. I forgot about the trees." Daniel mimiced coy, a look of profound understanding on his face. "She didn't know that, Victoria. I never told her about your sketches or your dreams. She just arrived that way. Maybe some things are just meant to be carried forward, even if the person who started them gets lost." Victoria realized then that the resemblance was purely a beautiful, cruel, and miraculous coincidence of the universe. But the emotional impact was the most real thing she had felt in decades. The hollowing feeling in her chest wasn't because of a lost biological child. It was because of the lost time and the lost version of herself. She looked at Daniel, the man who had stayed behind, the man who had loved and lost and still found a way to be soft, the man who hadn't looked away when she became the Ice Queen. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible over the rush of wind against the fuselage as they lowered the landing gear. "I'm sorry for the way I left. I was young, and I was so terrified that if I didn't run as fast as I could, I'd never become anyone. I didn't realize that in the process of becoming someone, I'd lose the only person who truly knew me." Daniel reached across the aisle. He didn't take her hand. They weren't there yet, but he rested his fingers on the mahogany armrest near hers. "We were young, Victoria. We made the only choices we knew how to make with the information we had. I don't regret my life. I love Sarah, and I have Clara, and you shouldn't regret yours. You built an empire. I built a fortress, she corrected, her voice steadying. But it's cold and very lonely inside, and I think I'm ready to come out. Then open a window, Daniel said with a small, encouraging wink. There was no dramatic swell of music, no cinematic embrace, just the heavy, honest acknowledgement of two people who had finally reached the end of a 20-year-old conversation. The jet tilted as it lined up with the runway at Heathrow. The clouds broke, revealing the shimmering, ancient lights of London below. Victoria felt lighter than she had since she was 22. The question, why does she look like me, finally had its answer. It wasn't about blood. It was about a reminder. The universe had sent a child with her face to tell her that the 8-year-old girl with the book on bridges and the dream of trees was still alive. She was just waiting to be remembered. The wheels hit the tarmac with a smooth, professional thud. The thrust reversers roared, shaking the cabin as they slowed the massive machine down to a taxi. As the jet slowed and the tension of the flight began to dissipate, Victoria turned to Daniel one last time. The professional mask was gone, replaced by something softer, something more human. "Thank you," she said. Daniel arched an eyebrow, his old playful spirit returning. "For what?" "The logistics report. I think I still need to send you the final draft of the Southeast Asia projections." "No," Victoria said, looking him straight in the eyes, refusing to blink. For not looking away. When I asked that question, when I saw her and lost my mind for a second, you could have lied. You could have been awkward or walked away. But you stayed. You looked right at me, even after all the years of silence. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt. "There was nothing to hide, Victoria. There never was. You were the one who thought the past was a secret that needed to be buried. To me, it was just a part of who I am. It shaped me. It made me the father I am today." There was no marriage proposal, no sudden realization that they were soulmates who needed to get married at the airport. Life isn't a movie. Victoria was still a CEO with 1,000 problems waiting for her on the ground. Daniel was still a single father with a life and a business in another country. But as the cabin door opened and the cool, damp night air of London rushed in, something fundamental had changed. The Ice Queen had started to melt. Clara stood up, stretching her small arms, and grabbed her father's hand. She looked at Victoria and gave her a small, shy wave. "Bye, Victoria. I hope you find some trees to build around in London. They have some nice parks here." Victoria felt a tear finally prick her eye, and this time she let it fall. She wiped it away with a smile. "I will, Clara, I promise. I'm going to go look for them tomorrow." She watched them walk down the air bridge. Daniel walked with his shoulders back, never looking back, his focus entirely on his daughter. Victoria stood at the top of the stairs, the wind whipping her hair across her face, the smell of jet fuel and rain filling her lungs. She had asked why the girl looked like her. The answer wasn't about DNA. It wasn't about secret affairs or hidden lies. The answer was about the things we leave behind when we chase the world. The answer was about the parts of ourselves we think we've killed for the sake of a career, only to find them blooming in the life of someone else. Victoria Langford walked back into her jet, but she didn't pick up her iPad. She didn't check her emails. She sat in the silence, looked at the empty seat where a little girl had just been laughing, and for the first time in 20 years, she picked up a pen and started to draw a bridge. A bridge made of stone, mud, and trees. And if you believe that sometimes a resemblance is just a reminder of the past you haven't closed yet, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment. Have you ever run into someone from your past in a way you never expected? Did they remind you of the person you used to be?